Hello and welcome to the axial skeleton. This video will cover the skull. So if you look at the skull, it's actually a combination of 22 different bones. There are 8 bones which form the cranium, so they're called cranial bones, and there are 14 bones which form the framework of your face, and so they're called facial bones. Some books also include 7 other bones, but we're going to call them associated bones because they're not truly part of the skull. But if you look at this, you can see what the skull looks like, and you can see the separation into the cranial bones and facial bones. So we're going to look at the cranial bones in this video. Here are those associated bones, and you can see just how small they are. And there's 7 of these. There's 3 tiny little bones in each middle ear, and then there's also a bone which is basically right around the Adam's apple. We'll get to those later. But here's a skull. If you look at it, this is one of the ones we have in the lab. It's actually not a very good skull, but one thing that's really neat about it is it comes apart into individual pieces, and so you can see what the individual bones look like. Here's what the real skull looks like. And you can see that the model pretty much approximates what the real skull looks like. One thing before we get started is I want to show you that if you open up the skull and look into the floor of the cranial cavity, remember this is where the brain sits, it can be divided up into 3 spaces, 3 depressions, and the word for depression in bones is fossa. So if you look at the blue one, that is toward the front, so it's anterior. It's part of this cranial bone, so it's cranial, and it's a depression. So this is the anterior cranial fossa. In the center part of the skull, there are 2 fossae, and so they're these middle cranial fossae. And then on the posterior part, you'll see a single fossa. It's also large, and so this is the posterior cranial fossa. We're going to refer back to this a little bit later, and so keep these 3 fossae in mind, even though they're not on your checklist. But we're going to look at the cranial bones first. And so remember, when you look at the cranial bones, here they are. Some bones are paired, some bones are single, but if you count them, remember there's a total of 8 cranial bones. And the first bone we're going to look at is this one. This is called the frontal bone. And the frontal bone forms your forehead. It also forms the tops of your eye orbits or eye sockets. And so if you look at it here as it's rotating, you can see pretty much what this bone looks like. If you look at it on a real skull or an intact skull, it looks like this. So there is our frontal bone. Well, it has some markings on it. And one of the markings is that the area right between the eye orbits, it's hollow. It has a name. It's called the glabella. So if you reach up and touch right above your nose between your eye orbits, that's the glabella. And we're going to see later that it's hollow and has a sinus there. We also have the eye orbits. And if you remember when it was rotating, the frontal bone forms the top part of the eye orbits. And so it forms these edges of the eye orbits, and edges are often called borders or they're called margins. So these are above the eye orbits. They're called the supraorbital margins. If you look in the center of each one of these margins, what you're going to see are tiny little holes. Remember the word for hole is foramen. So these are above the eye orbits. So they're supraorbital, just like supraorbital margin, but they're holes. So they're the supraorbital foramina. Singular is foramen. And so that's all that you have to know about the frontal bone. It's not very many. The next bones we're going to look at are the parietal bones. And so if you look at the parietal bones, they form the roof of your skull, of the cranium. And if you look at them, they're basically just squares. Now, they're not perfect squares, but they're pretty close. Well, a square has 4 sides, and so these parietal bones have 4 sides. Each of these sides joins onto another bone, and where bones join together in skulls, they're called sutures. Now, if you look at it, there are over 100 sutures in the skull. They all have names, but we're only going to learn 4, and the 4 we're going to learn match the 4 sides of the parietal bones. So if we look at the parietal bones, again, they look like this, and you can see these sutures. They look like little squiggly lines. And so one suture, you can see here, is between green and yellow. One here is between green and brown, and so on. So let's look at these sutures. The first one we're going to look at is between the frontal bone and the 2 parietal bones. And this crosses your head sort of like a crown would sit on your head. Also, remember back when we talked about sections, if you make a section that separates a front portion from a back portion, remember it's called frontal. And so this suture kind of follows that plane, and so it's either called the frontal suture or coronal suture, like crown. The next one we're going to look at is on the posterior part of the skull, and it looks like an upside down V, or the Greek letter lambda. Since it looks like the Greek letter lambda, it's called the lambdoidal suture. The next one we're going to look at follows right down the midline. And remember, if you make a section like this, that section is called a sagittal or mid-sagittal section. And so this suture is called the sagittal suture. And then there's one more, and that one is between this bone and the ones on the side. And so if you look at it, this part of the skull is very thin and very flat. And the thin flat cell, remember, was called squamous. And so this suture is called the squamous or squamosal suture. And in this picture, you can see it from both sides. It's a joint between these bones, and that's what all the sutures are. So if you look inside the skull, you can see these other sutures also. The next bone we're going to look at is called the temporal bones. There are 2 of these. And so if you look at them in this 3-dimensional view, you can see that they're kind of oddly shaped. Some parts are on the outside, but some parts project into the skull. And so to make it a little bit easier to talk about, we divide this bone up into regions. And so if you look at it, here it is on the side, that's the temporal bone. And if you look at it here, you can see the temporal bone as well. Well, remember there's a suture up at the top, and that suture is the squamous or squamosal suture. So the temporal bone is inferior to that suture. So let's look at the temporal bone. Again, it's divided up into regions. And so this region, which encompasses most of the upper part, this flat, thin part, and remember the word for that is squamous, it's called the squamous region. And then there's a region right around the ear canal. So if you put your finger in your ear, you're going to be in this region. And the ear has an eardrum, which is called the tympanic membrane. So the region is called the tympanic region. And then what's left over on the outside is a fairly large bump behind your ear. This area is thick and kind of rough. That bump is called the mastoid process, and so the region is called the mastoid region. So there are 3 regions that you can see from the outside. But remember, this bone also projects into the skull. And so there's a 4th region on the inside. So if you look at this picture, the pink part is the outer part of this bone. That's exactly what we were just looking at. That's where the squamous region, the tympanic region, and the mastoid regions are. But this is the part that projects inward, medially, and it forms ridges inside the skull, and it helps to form the middle cranial fossa that we were talking about before. Well, if you look at these projections, these diagonal sort of thick, rough things, they look a lot like mountains or maybe volcanoes. Well, the word for rock is petrous. And so these are called petrous regions or the rocky regions. If you take that bone off and look at it, it's easy to see this petrous region. It's this right here. And if you look at this petrous region, it does look a lot like a mountain, especially if you turn it in the other direction. Well, this petrous region has our first marking on it, and our first marking is a hole, but it doesn't go all the way through. It only goes part of the way through, so if you were to try to put a stick through it, you would not be able to. But this is called the internal acoustic meatus or internal acoustic canal. And so you can see here's the petrous region, there's that internal acoustic meatus or internal acoustic canal. If we look at the outside of this bone, remember we can divide it up into regions, but there are also markings here. So one of the markings that's here is your ear canal. Well, just like over here, we had an internal auditory or acoustic meatus. We also out here have an external auditory or acoustic meatus. And if you had the real skull in your hand, you would see that these two line up. And in between those two is where the three tiny little bones are located that are found in the middle ear, which we'll get to much later on. Another thing you can see on this side is this big heavy bump that's behind your ear. And if you put your hand behind your ear, you can find it easily. It's a large, heavy bump. Remember, this region was called the mastoid region, and the bump is called the mastoid process. If you move anteriorly from there, you're going to see a pointy, almost needle-like structure, and it looks a lot like a stylus, a writing instrument, so it's called the styloid process. You may remember from the upper appendage, we had the ulnar styloid process and the radial styloid process. So once again, if you say styloid process, you need to put the name of the bone after it. So this is the styloid process of the temporal bone. We can also see right here part of your cheekbone. Now your cheekbone is called the zygomatic. Well, this part is a process which goes to the zygomatic. So it's called the zygomatic process. And so you can see all four of these things fairly easily. So again, if you take it off, you can see all those things that we just looked at. The external acoustic meatus, the mastoid process, styloid process, zygomatic process. Here the bones have been separated, so you can see what it looks like. This is an inferior view, but you still should be able to see those things. In this inferior view, you can also see something else. Now, if you put it all together, it goes back like this. But what we're seeing when we look at this is we can see this. There's our styloid process. There's our mastoid process. And if you look right between these two, you're going to see a hole. And remember, that word for hole is foramen. Well, it's a hole between the styloid and the mastoid, so it's called the stylomastoid foramen. Another thing you can see in this view is where the jawbone attaches. So the jawbone attaches in a fossa. The jawbone is called the mandible, so this is the mandibular fossa. And if we take the jawbone out and flip it back over again, you can see those mandibular fossae. Another thing on this bone, if you look in the petrous region, there's a tunnel that goes through it. A tunnel is an elongated hole, so we don't call it a foramen, we call it a canal. And what goes through here is one of the major arteries that feeds your brain. That artery is called the carotid. And so the carotid goes through this carotid canal. If we blow that up, it looks like this. You can take a stick or a pointer and go all the way through this part of the bone. So the petrous region has a tunnel running through it. Right next to that carotid canal is another hole. And this one goes in the opposite direction. It's also a hole. And it's a fairly large hole, and it's sort of cashew-shaped. It's called the jugular foramen. If we blow that up, it looks like this. Nerves go through this hole, as well as the jugular vein. One other hole you can see here is at the end of the carotid canal. And if you look at this hole, it looks jagged. It looks lacerated. And so it's called the foramen lacerum. If we blow that up, you can see it here. And you can see just how jagged it is as well. The foramen lacerum is not in a bone. It's between two bones. And so it's not technically correct to say it's part of the temporal bone, because it's really between these three bones right here. It forms this triangle. If we flip the skull over and look at it, we can see this internal acoustic meatus, but we can also see these. And these are those cashew-shaped holes, which are the jugular foramen. We can also see the foramen lacerum from this side. And again, it's between or among these three bones. The next bone we're going to look at is the occipital bone. So the occipital bone is posterior and inferior. Look, it forms the back part of the skull, but also part of the bottom of the skull. And as it rotates, you can see that there's a big hole right in the middle of it. So if we look at that, we can see that big hole. And that big hole is actually called the big hole. But it's the Latin. It's foramen magnum. But magnum literally means big, and foramen means hole. So that's the big hole. The spinal cord goes through here to attach to the brain. On either side of this foramen magnum, we can see ridges. And if you look here, you can see them pretty well. They're sort of shaped like footprints, and they're raised. They're ridges. Well, these connect to the first vertebra. And so this is where the skull articulates with the vertebral column. Remember, bumps on bones are sometimes called condyles. And so these are called the occipital condyles. If you see this, you can see where they are. There's our foramen magnum, that big hole in the middle, and then there are the two occipital condyles on either side of it. If we blow it up, you can see the foramen magnum here and a very nice view of these occipital condyles. Well, superior to the occipital condyle, now this is upside down, so it's backwards, but superior to the occipital condyle is a hole. And a nerve goes through here, which is called the hypoglossal nerve. And so the hole is called the hypoglossal canal. So we've learned the carotid canal, we've learned the jugular foramen, we've learned the foramen magnum, the foramen lacerum, the occipital condyles, and the hypoglossal canals. In this picture, you can see that there is actually a red stick through the hypoglossal canals and a black stick through the jugular foramen, showing you they are indeed holes. Now, some skulls, some people have little tiny holes right by the condyles. Not all people have these, but if they are present, they're called condylar canals. Condylar canals are not on your checklist. If we look at the inside or internal view of this occipital bone, it looks like this. And if you look at it, you can see a vertical line and a horizontal line, and they cross So right there where these two lines cross, you're going to see 4 spaces. So there are 4 spaces created. These spaces are depressions, and so they're called fossae. And there are 4 of these. So here you can see the straight line and the horizontal line. And the upper 2 fossae are called the fossae for the cerebrum. And a part of the skull, or part of the brain called the cerebrum fits in these fossae. But there's 2 others as well, and you can see those here. So we can see the cross, and we see 2 inferior fossae. Well, a different part of the brain fits in here. That part of the brain is the cerebellum. So these are called the fossae for the cerebellum. The next bone we're going to look at is this one. This is called the sphenoid bone. So look at this bone. It sort of sits in the middle of a bunch of bones. In fact, all of the other cranial bones attach to this bone one way or another. So it's sort of like a keystone kind of bone. It sort of holds everything together. Well, if you look at it, it looks a lot like a butterfly or some sort of moth or something like that. If you look at the lower part of this picture, you can see how it fits together inside the skull and how all of these other bones are connected to it one way or another. Well, when you look at this bone, again, it looks like a bug. It looks like a moth or a butterfly. And if you think about a moth or a butterfly, they have a body, they have antennae, they have wings, and they have legs. And you should be able to see all those things in this picture. So when we look at this bone, this looks like this. This is a superior view, and we're looking down into the skull. And so this is a separation between the anterior cranial fossa and the 2 middle cranial fossae. Well, again, this is the sphenoid bone, and you can see it here. If you look at the inferior side of the skull, it looks like this, and you can see those legs. Now, they're pointing up toward you right now, but you can see them. If you take the skull apart and look at it, that's what the sphenoid looks like from the bottom. So here in this rotating view, you can see all these different parts. So you can see that it has a body, it has wings, it has legs, and it has antennae. Well, all of these are bone markings. If you look at the 3 pictures here, you can see what they're called. So the wings part are called wings. They're called the greater wings. But the parts that are called antennae are not called that. They're called lesser wings. And the legs are called pterygoid processes. Pterygoid means 2 toes or 2 claws. And so if you look at it, that's what they look like a crab or something, or a pterodactyl. So we have greater wings, we have lesser wings, and we have pterygoid processes. So if we take the bone out and look at it, we can see these different parts. Again, this is a superior view, so you can't see the pterygoid processes, but you can see the body, you can see the greater wings, and you can see the lesser wings. In order to see the pterygoid processes, we have to look at it from this view. But here, you can still see the body. You can still see the greater wings. You can still see the lesser wings. And now you can see the pterygoid processes. So, lesser wings. And if you look at the lesser wings and follow them to where they attach to the body, you'll see a pair of holes. These holes, if you were to poke a stick through here, it would come out in the eye orbit. And what goes through here is the nerve that carries your sense of sight. That nerve is called the optic nerve. And so these are called the optic foramen or optic canals. If you look at the greater wing, what you're going to see are 3 holes. and they are sort of in a row. There's a round hole, an oval hole, and a little tiny hole. The round hole is just called the round hole. In Latin, that's foramen rotundum. The oval hole is just called the oval hole. And in Latin, that's called the foramen ovale. And this little bitty hole has sort of a spiny appearance, so it's called the foramen spinosum. Nerves and blood vessels go through these holes as well. So if we look at it again, rotundum, ovale, spinosum, and then the optic canals. We can see the same thing in this picture. And so if you look at the greater wing, there are these holes, 3 of them in a row, rotundum, ovale, spinosum. We already learned the lacerum, so it's right next to, it's right medial to the ovale. If you take it off and look at it again, you can see these holes. You can see the optic foramen, you can see the foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. You can also see the greater wing and lesser wing. Well, if you look at the body of this bone, and you look at the top part of it, it looks almost as if there's a saddle there. Like you could ride this butterfly while it was flying. So you would sit in this saddle. Well, it looks like a saddle, but it looks like a particular kind of saddle. A particular kind of saddle, it looks like, is a Turkish saddle. And so that's exactly what it's called. The Turkish saddle or Turkish seat. So that's the sella turcica. We can also see down here at the bottom, we can see these pterygoid processes. Well, remember there are 2 claws or 2 plates. There's a medial plate. Remember, medial means toward the midline. And there's a lateral plate, which means away from the midline. So hopefully you can pick out all of those individual things. If you look at the body, you can see the greater wings and lesser wings. Well, you'll see that there's a fissure between them. That fissure goes into the eye orbit. It's called the superior orbital fissure. And nerves and blood vessels also go through here. So if you blow up the eye orbit, we're looking straight into a person's eye. We can see the optic canal, and we can see the superior orbital fissure. You can also see in this picture there's an inferior orbital fissure. And look, they sort of meet and form a sort of a boomerang shape or a sideways V shape. The next bone we're going to look at is called the ethmoid bone. And this is the last of the cranial bones. The ethmoid bone is sort of behind the nose. It's between the eye orbits. And it forms the medial portion of that eye socket. It also has a little tiny portion which extends up into the skull. So if we look inside the skull, we can see that. It's this browned part right here. And when you look at it, it sticks up and it's pointy. And someone thought that it looked like a rooster's comb. And so that's what it's called. It's the crista galli. Well, all around this crista galli is an area with little tiny holes. That's called the cribiform plate. If we blow that up and look at it, there's our crista galli. And the little tiny holes, that's the cribiform plate. Each individual hole is called an olfactory foramen. And the nerves that carry your sense of smell go through these holes. If we blow it up even more, it looks like this. So there's the crista galli. And here are the olfactory foramina of this cribiform plate. If you look at it in an anterior view, again, you can see the crista galli, the cribriform plate. And if you look at it on an x-ray, you can also see the crista galli and cribriform plate. But this bone also hangs down into the nasal cavity. And when it hangs down into the nasal cavity, it forms other structures. One of those is the perpendicular plate. And the perpendicular plate is part of what divides your nose in half. So if you look inside, you can see it hanging straight down. That is the perpendicular plate. And then if you look on either side of the perpendicular plate, you're going to see other structures hanging down. They're actually curled, almost like seashells. And so they're called conchi. That means little seashell. Well, there are actually 3 pairs of these. You can count them, 3 on each side. But only 2 pairs are part of this bone. They're called superior, middle, and inferior. But only the superior nasal conchi and the middle nasal conchi are part of this bone. The bottom ones are different bones, and we'll come back to those later on. So if you look at this bone, if you take it off, you can see the crista galli, you can see the superior and middle nasal conchi, and you can see the perpendicular plate. So if you look into the skull, we can see those things that we've already talked about. And so here's kind of a review of those things. And you can come back to this and you can practice with it if you need to. But these are the holes, openings, that you find inside the skull. So if I were you, I would start it here at the front. Let the thing come up, try to figure out what it is and get the answer. Go to the next one, try to figure out what it is and get the answer, and so on, until you're sure that you know all of these holes. So, that's the end of this video.